generally, learning and educational process is not anymore this kind of Prussian school on the left, where kids sit and they don't move at all, and they just they get some task and they talk back to teacher, and then the only feedback is maybe a slap on the wrist or something. Today, a modern classroom is everybody is moving. Kids are encouraged to form new constellations, interactions, talk to each other, not only to the teacher. And so we want to end also cognitive science with this embodied approach that can apply some of those principles of how we can study interactions. We want to bring those two things together, and we will analyze the way students interact with each other and how they interact with teachers, and how to connect those findings with some qualitative aspects of the learning process. We joined our study. We joined a study of Copernicus Science Center. It was a already existing study under development about furniture mobility when they were trying out two prototypes of furniture, which wasn't our concern. However, we saw the opportunity and made this exploratory study without any funding. So there are some limitations connected to this type of paradigm, but that we need to remember. Generally, the paradigm looked as follows. Classes came to the Copernicus Science Center twice. They had a set of scenarios, lesson scenarios that they were following. However, their own teacher did the whole lesson. So they were kids, 6th and 7th graders who knew each other and they knew their teacher, and they came for a lesson. And there were also 2 classrooms with 2 those types of furnitures, but it's not our concern. We did video recordings that were annotated by our coders, and then after the lesson, the kids would fill out questionnaires about how they felt during the lesson, and about some perceived quality of the lesson. So did they like the content? Did they like that the teacher asked them questions, and so on, as well as some open-ended questions, but we didn't analyze them. And to our idea is that we can give out those HR monitoring smartbands. They are easy to set up. You just ask people to put it on like a smartwatch. They're great for group studies because of this. You need to remember that at some point, like about hundreds of people came to the lab, and we had to be quick about it. They're also super cheap. They are $85 a piece, and they are portable. So this is absolutely adequate for this modern classroom that we are talking about. This is not a medical grade equipment, so we had to pre-process the signal a little bit, and they are not fit for precise measurements. So normally in cognitive science, people are interested in things like heart rate variability and interbeat intervals, so like milliseconds differences. And here we don't do that, so we don't have this problem. The scenarios looked as follows. There was a brief introduction followed by 3 tasks that they consecutively did. Each task had the following structure. It had an introduction made by the teacher, a group work, a work part, and then a quick summary. Here are the times. Every lesson was about 45 minutes. However, teachers tend to make it a bit longer. And here is how it looked. So the first task was this kind of more traditionally individual The second was group talks, and the third is a work on the forum. And this is like inherent to the kind of data that we gathered, that we had some dropouts, but overall we have recordings from 18 lessons. Yeah, and because, but we double counted them, so we count each, although they came twice, we count each lesson as a separate thing. They came on different days, different times of, different hours, so yeah, that's how we did it. All right.
It's your turn.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, can I?
Yep, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so as Witold said, we joined another study, but they were only interested in the mobile furniture in the classroom, but we thought that, okay, it's a nice opportunity to add our research agenda to this study, and since we are coming from social interaction, ecological psychology, and so on, we're interested in studying the social, this kind of social situation that is happening in the classroom. So what we're mostly interested in was how the emotions of the students and their learning experience, whether it can be predicted based on the changes in the heart rates of the students. And we, yeah, because from the literature we know that heart rate is related to engagement in the task, to perception of something important for a person, but it is not clear how it is associated to specific emotions. And in the context of education research, it has been studied both in association to positive and negative emotions of the students. So we wanted to investigate that, and we split it into 3 research questions. First one, what we can learn on students' emotions during lesson based solely on the analysis of their heart rates. The second question is what we can learn when we analyze those heart rates, but in the context of specific activities that happens during the lesson. So we know that lesson is a very structured social activity. It has introduction, the part in which teacher is giving a lecture, the part in which students are more doing their own work. So we wanted to test how the changes in heart rate correlates, whether it correlates with different emotions during these different lesson activities. And the third one that was most important for us, as we feel that we touched something important here, is whether what we can predict based on the coordination of heart rate between students and the teacher during lesson. Yeah. So the results. As to the first research question, we simply took mean heart rates of the students and checked with what emotions did it correlate. So as Witold said, after the lesson there were questionnaires in which students reported their emotions that they experienced during the lesson. As you can see, we found a slight negative correlation between the mean heart rate of the student and feeling unhappy. So it means that the lower the mean heart rate of a student, the more unhappy he or she felt during the lesson. And we found also similar correlation according to referring to the teachers, but in the opposite direction. So the higher mean heart rate of a teacher, the more unhappy the students felt, which is kind of intuitive. But of course, this approach is very limited, right? We have individual differences between people related to heart rate, also age differences among teachers. So that's not that much informative. And what is often done in such kind of studies is that you have before experiment, you record a baseline heart rate of a given person and then relate the heart rate during the experiment to that baseline, but we couldn't do this. So we did something different, and that's our research question too. So we wanted to test how how the heart rate during a specific activity of a student relates to the activity during the whole lesson. So how we calculated it. We took a mean heart rate for a whole lesson for a specific person. This is this red line. And then we annotated this data with the times of the specific activities that happened during lessons. So for instance, the blue one is introduction, then the yellow parts are the parts in which teacher was giving instruction to students, orange parts is work. And then for each activity, we calculated how on average it differs from the mean during the whole lesson. And we wanted to see how this increased, this changes in a person activity related to his mean, how it correlates to emotions or reported experience of the students. So this is what we found out, is that during when the teacher was giving instruction, the heart rate correlated negatively with being surprised, meaning that the students that had lower heart rate during the giving instruction were more surprised during the lesson. And again, the questionnaires were took after the whole lesson, right? So this makes sense, as we know that the heart rate indicates being engaged in the task. So students that were not engaged when teacher was giving instructions were more surprised, let's say. Then we found that during work, there was a correlation between changes in heart rate and feeling joyful and nervous, in this direction that the higher the heart rate of a student during his own work, the more nervous he felt, and in the opposite direction with joy. And then we found no correlation during the summary. So the main point here is that the heart rate during the lesson is contextual, in a sense that it correlates with different students' emotion depending on the current activity during the lesson. And to see it more vividly even, we can compare these two results. So here we have the correlation of a heart rate during the student's work. And here we have correlation of a student's heart rate during the introduction. As you can see, in both cases, the feeling nervous and feeling joyful correlates, but in the opposite directions. So what it means is that once students reported that they were nervous during the lesson, they had tendency to have lower heart rate during introduction, possibly not paying attention when teacher was introducing the topic of the lesson. And then they felt, then they had higher heart rate during their own work, possibly because of being nervous that they don't know what to do during their own work. We also had this more descriptive questionnaire about experiences of students. So there were several questions, both positive and negative. For instance, I had fun during the lesson really engaged me, but also the lesson was a waste of time, or this class wasn't for me. So we wanted to see how changes in heart rate correlated with those questions. So again, we found slight correlations, but still, that for instance, during instruction, the heart rate correlated positively with the question, I know what this lesson was supposed to be about, so it makes, oh, that's bad. So it makes sense because this is what the giving instruction is about students knowing what the lesson is supposed to be about. Then we have also correlations that make sense during work. So for instance, I like that we work in groups, or that I could try something for myself instead of listening to lecture. And also the same happens in summary, that the students with a higher heart rate liked more that the teacher asked us questions and asked for our opinions, which is something that usually happens during summary. So again, the main point here is that heart rate is contextual in a sense that it correlates with specific things that are going on during the specific parts of the lesson. So now the research question 3, coordination. which we calculated in that way. We used cross-recurrence analysis for that, which is a method often employed to calculate group dynamics and coordination between two people, for instance. So we change our heart rate data into series of 1, -1, and zeros. 1 is increasing heart rate, -1 is decreasing heart rate, and 0 is stable. And then we, for each teacher-student pair, we calculated cross-recurrence analysis, which basically tells us how much these two data series are correlated. But it is also, this method is sensitive to kind of leader-follower dynamics, so it doesn't necessarily mean that the same thing happens in both data series, but for instance, when one person has increasing heart rate and then the other one, a while after that, has increasing heart rate, then this method would be sensitive to this. So we calculated this cross-recurrence analysis, and then we choose determinism, which is a measure of strength of the coupling between two time series. And what we found out is that the coordination were more or less similar during the whole lesson, the different activities. But, which is one of the most interesting results that we had, is that during the whole lesson, the determinism, which is, again, the coordination between teacher and the students, correlated with those two answers. One is rather intuitive. The teacher explained to us clearly what we were supposed to do. We have a positive correlation here, meaning that the more teacher and students were coordinated, the more students felt that the teacher explained clearly what they were supposed to do. But the second one is more of surprising for us. And it is our most significant and our strongest correlation with the question. I sometimes had to think really hard to figure out how to complete a task, meaning that if the result is right, that here determinism was an indicator of a cognitive effort of a student. And again, this was not shown in the previous data, so it is not only about increased heart rate, but about kind of increased heart rate, but in a coordinated way with a teacher. So that will be something new if that result is right. Yeah, and we can see that they both correlated, especially during the work of the students, their own work, which makes sense, and no such correlations were found during introduction or summary. Yeah, and also we found interesting correlations during giving instruction between the coordination of teacher and student and the answers that they give. So we have, for instance, a negative correlation between the coordination and the answer to the question, this wasn't class for me. Negative in the sense that the less they were coordinated, the students with the teacher, the more they felt that the lesson wasn't for them. And here is our result that we do not know how to interpret yet, but you can see that we also have a negative correlation with being curious, meaning that the more the students were coordinated with the teacher, the less they reported being curious. So possible interpretation is that it's not necessarily, okay, maybe it's not that easy to interpret what it means that a student is coordinated with a teacher, whether it means necessarily that the lesson is, okay, last one slide. It does not necessarily mean that the lesson was good or that it was interesting for students. So this result could be, for instance, that the students that were curious were just, more joyful, more explorative, not listen to the teacher. So it is not necessarily that the highest determinism is something that we would like to have in classroom dynamics. Yeah, so just conclusions. What we found out in our results is that both the coordination and the increased heart rates are very contextual, and depending on what's going on during the lesson. Yeah, maybe I'll just finish with that. Thank you, and we would like to thank our collaborators for Copernicus Science Center. Yeah, thank you.
All right, so let's start off with some, oh, it's not moving. Now it works, okay. Let's start off with some kind of, with my sort of general starting point. Namely that our social cognition sometimes involves attributing mental states to others. And that we wonder what other people are thinking or feeling. So, I mean, as indicated by this meme, this seems to be something which we at least sometimes do and is like a common phenomenon. But as this meme also seems to indicate, it appears to be something which is really complex because there are all kinds of things that people around us could be thinking, and working out what exactly it is they are thinking, therefore seems to be quite a sort of challenging task. On the other hand, we also sometimes are right about what other people are thinking. So we're not constantly wrong. It's not a kind of complete mess. So occasionally we do manage the seemingly highly complex task of attributing mental states to others correctly. So baseline that we are at least sometimes competent at this, if not even mostly or frequently. So the question then is, how do we do this? And what I'll be focusing on in this talk is looking at two kind of very different theories of how mental state attribution works. So both mind reading and mind shaping, which I'll explain in a moment, agree that social cognition involves the attribution of mental states. So this kind of sets them apart from some other theories of social cognition that actually dispute the role of mental state attribution. But I won't be focusing on that today. So today, the baseline will be that mental state attribution plays some kind of a role. So these two theories disagree about the function of mental state attribution. So mind reading theories say that mental state attribution is descriptive. So when I look at my partner and he's gone to the fridge, I attribute him the state of being hungry, and this is supposed to be describing a mental state that I think he has. So therefore, the kind of question would be, am I correct in him actually having that mental state? Or that the mother comforting her child is kind of just detecting a mental state of the child that is actually there. The mind-shaping approach, on the other hand, says that mental state attribution is often, or primarily, a normative endeavor. So when we attribute mental states to others, we don't do so primarily to determine or just to detect a kind of pre-existing mental state, but actually what we're doing is we are kind of bringing about all kinds of normative expectations of what is appropriate when having a certain mental state. So for example, if we look at the mother with the child, when she's thinking, oh, my child is sad, this is not just a descriptive process, but she actually brings normative ideas about kind of what sort of behavior is appropriate, and will be communicating those to the child. And so even though mind reading, kind of this descriptive aspect, seems to be quite intuitive, defenders of mind shaping often argue that we do actually correct people regarding mental states. So we tell them whether something is appropriate to believe or not, what kind of desires are reasonable or not, and so on, so that there's emphasis on this normative dimension. So many people who argue for mind-shaping views often argue that it's an alternative position to mind reading. So this is a kind of statement that McGeer, one of the defenders of mind-shaping views, says. She says, the regulative view rejects the standard idea that folk psychology involves a primary capacity for discovering or detecting pre-existing mental states. Rather, it argues that folk psychology involves a primary capacity for forming and regulating our mental states in accordance with a rich array of socially shared and socially maintained sense-making norms. However, most views of mind shaping don't rule out mind reading completely. So they say, well, sometimes we also do actually want to kind of descriptively attribute mental states. It's just that there is a sort of a specific emphasis on this mind shaping. And in particular, one version of this claim, which I'll be focusing on today, is the claim that mind shaping is actually required in order for mind reading to be possible. So I call this the primacy of mind-shaping claim, and this is the claim that I want to be critically assessing today. So I will not be looking at the question of whether social cognition is primarily mind-reading or mind-shaping, but rather this kind of question of like, is mind-shaping required first in order to be able to even get to mind-reading? So there are two versions of this primacy claim. The first is the idea that mind shaping is phylogenetically prior to mind reading, so the idea that mind reading is required in order to explain the evolution of distinctively human mind reading. So without mind shaping evolutionarily, we would never have been able to get to the point of mind reading. And there's a second, considerably less discussed primacy point, namely that mind shaping is ontogenetically prior to mind reading, so that in ontogenetic development from childhood to adulthood, there is a starting point where mind shaping is initially required in order to be able to reach the mind reading stage. And it's important to note that these claims are somewhat independent, so we might think that there is a phylogenetic primacy of mind reading, but not ontogenetic, and vice versa. However, most people say that the claims are at least somewhat connected in that they could come apart, but it probably wouldn't support the phylogenetic claim massively if it turned out that the ontogenetic claim fell through, for example. So that's, for example, something that the reason why Zawadzki discusses this to some extent. Although, like I said, it is possible to keep them separate. And I'll be focusing today basically exclusively on the ontogenetic claim, which is the one which has so far received much less discussion in the literature also. So my next steps for this talk will be that, first of all, I'll be presenting the intractability argument, which is one of the main arguments given for the primacy of mind shaping. I'll then look at two responses which can be given to this argument and explain why they only partially work. And finally, I'll kind of conclude with summing up what I think is the remaining case for mind shaping. So to give the game away, I think there is some merit to the claim of the primacy of mind shaping, but it's maybe not as strong as some of the advocates of mind shaping would like it to be. So let's begin with the intractability argument. I'll be following broadly some arguments from Zawadzki here, even though he's not the only one who's made arguments along this line. So it starts off with the first kind of idea that mind reading is complex to the point of being intractable. And he says there are two reasons for this, basically. The first is the holism of the mental. So this idea that basically any kind of mental state would be compatible with a whole range of behaviors. So if I am sad, I could be crying, I could even be laughing, I could be performing all kinds of, maybe I'd just be dejected, maybe I would just be sitting. So there's a sort of massive range of mental states, massive range of behavior for each mental state, and vice versa also. So for each kind of behavior, there could be a wide range of mental states which caused it. So therefore, there's like a massive search space, basically, that he says would be impossible for us to kind of accurately get through. But perhaps less theoretically also, because we might think, okay, maybe theoretically it's possible that there's a massive search space, but we're all humans, we all kind of work similar, so maybe that's not actually really so problematic. He also says, well, there's also just a whole lot of actual individual variation between people and how they respond to situations, what kind of mental states they have, and so on. So this brings in complexity. And also the same individual at different times will vary in terms of the connections between mental states and behaviors. So this, he says, just would make mind reading incredibly difficult and implausible for an individual to be able to work out. But he presents a solution, namely that we have mind shaping. Mind shaping reduces the complexity of mind reading, thus making mind reading possible. So the idea is that through mind shaping and through enforcing kind of norms regarding behavior and mental state, we reach a kind of increasing uniformity which narrows down the possibilities far enough that we're able to engage in mind reading. And McGeer gives a very nice example to kind of illustrate this of a rugby game. If you're watching a rugby game and you know nothing about rugby, it's really difficult for you to understand what the people there are doing. Once you understand the rules of the game, however, it becomes much easier to understand what the other people are doing. So once you are shaped by those rules. But at the same time also, if you are a complete novice who doesn't know the rules of rugby and you are on the pitch playing with others, you will be very hard for the others to understand also because your behavior is not predictable. So there's this kind of bidirectional interaction here between kind of predicting and being predictable. Which mind shaping, kind of brings into line and therefore is supposed to allow mind reading. So like I said, this argument by Zawadzki was primarily developed for the phylogenetic case, but I want to say that I think it works as well, if not even better, for the ontogenetic case. So firstly, it seems plausible that young children have even fewer computational resources, so the intractability seems, if anything, even more serious a problem if you don't have these capacities or reduced capacities. At the same time, also, if we're looking at the ontogenetic case, we are in a society of already enculturated mind shapers. So in a sense, when the child comes in, he's playing with a team of people who are already kind of experienced in what they're doing, who can teach them the rules, as opposed to having a situation where we have to invent the game in the first place. So that also seems that there the mind shaping actually is easier to do because we don't have to explain how folk psychology got off the ground in the first place. Now I want to look at two kind of ways of responding to this argument. For those people who do not want to say that we always have to have mind shaping in order for mind reading to be possible. So there are two routes. The first being that we can question whether mind reading actually is intractable in the way that Zawadzki thinks it is. And the second being that we can explore other alternatives maybe of reducing the kind of complexity of mind reading. So I'll go through them each in turn. Starting with this issue of, is mind reading really so intractable? So Zawadzki's argument is built on the assumption that accurate mind reading would be too complex, in specific focus on the accurate, because of course we could attribute any mental state to other people. The problem really comes into it if we're trying to get the right mental state that we're attributing to people. But we could question whether mind reading really aims to be accurate in that way. So Evan Westra, for example, has argued that we don't actually know how accurate mind reading is, and that this is something which is difficult to assess both kind of conceptually and empirically, because we don't even have a super good idea of what it means to be accurate in terms of it when we attribute a mental state to others. So what would be the kind of success conditions of it? So maybe then, you know, somebody who wants to not adopt the primacy of mind shaping could say, well, mind reading is possible, it's just inaccurate. We just get it wrong a lot exactly because it's so complex. But we probably want to be cautious about going too far down this route, because if mind reading is supposed to play an important role for social cognition, it needs to be at least accurate enough to allow for collaboration and interaction in society if it is to be of any use. So we can't just say, okay, it's fine, just attribute whatever mental state you like. There needs to be some kind of coordination at least happening still. But then the question, of course, is, would this minimal form of accuracy still lead to intractability? And I think that's somewhat an open question, whether that would be the case. So the reason for this is that I think one thing to consider is that we have to differentiate between very broad and specific mental state ascription. So if I'm trying to ascribe a very specific mental state to others, this might be much more complex. But maybe ascribing general mental states or just kind of broad categories is likely to be much easier. So for example, if I'm just attributing happiness or even just positive affect in general, this is probably much less complex as opposed to attributing the specific delight at the fortune of a change in the weather. So the more specific we get, the more complex it's likely to get. However, then we are limited to quite broad mental states. A second thing that we might think about also is that some mental states might be directly perceivable. In that kind of context, then the complexity issue seems not to arise at all, because I can just see what the mental state of other people is. So this is if we follow arguments from people like Gallagher, who say that at least some mental states are just perceivable and don't require a kind of complex reasoning or a kind of inductive process in order to determine what it might be. But I think there are two ways to respond for primacy or to maintain that maybe this argument for the primacy of mind shaping does hold. So the first route we can take is to grant that very general mental state descriptions do not fall under the intractability argument, which is something which Zawadzki even to some extent does, because he says he wants to focus on specifically human mental state description, and this is supposed to be the kind of like high-level cognitive mental states. So maybe, you know, this sort of like broadly ascribing happiness and sort of very general propositional thoughts possibly even just wouldn't fall under this. But for basically everything going beyond that, the argument might hold. The second question we could ask is whether even broad mental state attribution is possible to such a full extent. So the first point regarding the direct perception of mental states, it could be that, in fact, our ability to perceive the mental states of others depends already on prior mind shaping, which constrains expression. So it's only once we have been mind shaped to express certain emotions, for example, in a particular way, that we are then able to directly perceive them. A second point to note is if we are thinking that there are simple situations where it just seems really obvious to us that the mental states are constrained because, for example, why else would somebody be looking in the fridge if not for food and so on? It's important to bear in mind that often it's only obvious to us what is relevant and what isn't due to like previous experiences and what we've learned. So in that sense, mind shaping can give us an explanation of why certain things are obvious to us while others are not. So to conclude on the first point, I want to kind of be cautious about this and say, well, and grant that, well, maybe not all forms of mind reading are intractable. Maybe there could be some basic forms of mind reading which are less demanding. However, this is a fairly kind of limited category. But what about the second point, the issue of kind of exploring alternative ways to reduce complexity? So some people have taken this route and don't deny that mind reading is complex, but claim that there are alternative ways to reduce this. So for example, Peters has argued that stereotypes and biases reduce complexity. And I, in a paper with some colleagues, have argued that background information is also a possible way of narrowing down the possibilities of the mental states that we can be attributed. So here again, I want to say that there are two ways in which the advocate of mind shaping can respond. The first would be to say that stereotyping and use of background information are just further instances of mind shaping at play. So Peters has some arguments about why he thinks that that's not the case. I'm not sure whether they are fully convincing, but that's something we can discuss if people are interested. Because I want to go with a second way of responding, namely to say that stereotypes and background information may reduce the complexity of mind reading, but they do so at the cost of bringing complexity in at other places. So the child who knows stereotypes and is able to use the background information is nonetheless now required to process all of this background information and be able to work with it. And therefore, we might worry that we've kind of traded complexity in different places. We've traded the complexity at the mental state attribution for having to consider a much wider picture. Mind shaping, on the other hand, seems to move the complexity from the individual to the group. So through mind shaping, where people's behavior becomes more uniform, the kind of complexity reduction happens at the level of reducing the kind of variance and complexity in behavior, rather than at the level of having to be able to remember different contexts and more amounts of information. So to conclude on the second point, the idea is that biases and stereotypes and background information can also reduce the complexity, but they do so at the kind of the cost of increasing complexity in other places, while mind shaping distributes the challenge of mind reading and the cognitive load that comes with it across the group. We might think that this is especially important from the perspective of a child learning social cognition. So rather than the child having to do all the work of learning all the rules of social cognition, much of the work is already done by the community of mind shapers. So finally, I want to say something about mind shaping and mind reading beyond development, because so far I've only argued that mind shaping is important for initiating people into social practices and that it can play an important role in infancy and childhood. But I think there's actually also a case for saying that mind shaping remains important beyond this. Namely, our practices of folk psychology require maintenance, which mind shaping provides. And we continue to meet new people and join different groups where mind shaping again might be required in order to enable fluid mind reading. And this is, I think, something that's plausible, that when we encounter people from different contexts and cultures, it sometimes takes a bit of time in order for the sort of understanding of each other to improve. So finally, to conclude, I want to say that mind shaping perhaps does not always have to precede mind reading. It's not always required in order to reduce the intractability of mind reading. However, mind shaping provides a distinct advantage in that it reduces the cognitive load by spreading it across the group. Therefore, while not being the only way to provide the groundwork for mind reading, it might be a particularly good and efficient way of doing so. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
So many different species are social and show very complex social alignment, coordination, even when they're actually not that complex in their, say, brain development, brain structures, and size as humans are. So it's not just potentially about brain size, but there potentially are also maybe what's going on in the brain. There's also a uniquely human aspect of intersubjectivity. We don't have to say there's something very specific, like we are the unique little flower that's like super special. But there's something that's different about humans, what it means to be human, what it means to interact with others. So this is something that needs to be explained. And the question is it like a matter of degree? Is it like a continuous scale? Is it got to do with brain size, unique cognitive modules, sensitivity, communicative signals, or some of the answers that have been put forward, and depending on how you carve out your question or the point that you want to raise, you can sort of categorize other animals and group them together and class them and suggest whether, well, they have this form or they don't. Now, the kind of frustrating thing is that we need to explain both the similarities and differences between humans, apes, and other animals, and we need to figure out the process from how we can get from one to the other. And this is why enactivism has quite appealed to me as someone that's more in an applied field in quotation marks, in order to understand how we get from A to B, how we get from, say, organismic exploration and trying to sustain yourself to things like coordinating, doing things together. So what are some current approaches to well, social problems, social coordination from an enactivist perspective? There's interaction theory by Sean Gallagher, and he's appealing to some developmental precursors. There's Di Paolo and Diega, who are talking about participatory sense-making, and also Susan Stewart, who talks about kinesthesia. I'll do a very brief run-through of their proposals. So Diega and Di Paolo are talking about participatory sense-making as the coordination of intentional activity and interaction, whereby individual sense-making processes are affected and new domains of social sense-making can be generated that were not available to each individual on their own. So there's a kind of like an emergence taking place in this participatory sense-making process of things that were previously potentially not there. And they argue that we need to explain how this comes about ontogenetically, but actually when you look at their concrete proposals, there's some really nice, interesting ideas there, but and in particular when it comes to how babies might make sense of the world, but there's not that much information on what's actually the defining, like what's different between humans, what's different between animals. So, for example, why are humans so likely and so deeply entrained with each other? I mean, you're sitting here, you're waiting for me to finish my talk and go into your lunch break, but you're still sitting here. You think that there's some merit in sitting here. Susan Stewart has a more effectively loaded, even more effectively loaded idea about how this might take place and how it's grounded in multisensory exploration. And again, she works a lot with, for example, ideas from Trevathan and Reddy and others, and the idea of like sort of being aware of what that the other is there. There's the reciprocity of gaze, of interactions, and those kind of things. But again, how does that come about? Like, what is this? So, for example, with gaze, we have a very interaction with the gaze of another person than most animals have with each other. If you stare at a cat, that's going to be very confrontational. In humans, well, it depends on how you do it exactly. But okay, so Sean Gallagher looks at more the specific, at some point has this general idea of an interactive theory of mind. We learn theory of mind through interactions with others, and that kind of, we don't actually need to infer any information about them. Most of the things that need to be inferred are actually, or that people thought need to be inferred, are directly accessible. We've heard about this just now. So, yeah, that's nice and all nice, but actually, how does this come about in infancy? I mean, this doesn't just, where does it come from? Like, is this just, say, a mental module, and in some of his books, Gallagher talks about the emergence of an innate mirror neural system, appeals to Maltzoff and Moore, has been lots of problems with that line of research, and he recognizes that and suggests, oh, well, maybe it is something to do with interacting with others in the way that also Jevata and Reddy have argued. And there's something about infants exploiting contingencies and learning from interacting with others. But then there's like, when you actually go back to that work, there's also appeal to innate components, and they're not really well specified, but they have to be there to explain why humans do it. And he's got a paper with Vincini and Gallagher, where he's also discussing some of the merit of potentially nativist explanations. But yeah, interactions are important, but why are they so prevalent in humans? And if human intersubjectivity is simply innate, what does that mean from an active perspective? Like, what's there to explain? Like, what is actually part of this? How is this interfacing with sense making? So in a way, it doesn't really tell us that much. Some of these approaches are too wide. They encompass all sorts of animals. They don't really specify. It's all sense making all the way down. And some of them are just so specific and potentially not really applicable to humans, potentially. Some people might disagree, but we can discuss that afterwards. Okay, going back to square one. What is the inactive approach, actually? So, for example, we can, based on Thompson and Stapleton, they've summarized it nicely. The inactive approach starts from the question of how a system must be organized in order to be an autonomous system, one that generates and sustains its own activity and thereby enacts or brings forth its own cognitive domain. So what does that mean for, well, kind of any developmental organism, and a human baby specifically? When we look at the sensory development of species, we can notice a couple of peculiarities. That across all domains, across a wide range of species, the different senses come online in the same order: tactile, vestibular, chemical, auditory, and visual. But species-specific differences emerge from shielding these sensory systems from inputs and thereby shifting the availability of information to these systems, and messing with the system actually impedes learning of socially relevant functions. For example, identify if I shine light into an egg, the chick might not learn the species-specific alarm call in the egg, but only later on in life. And you can see this across a wide range of species, how this is done. For example, in kittens, they come into this world with their eyes closed. When they're born, they can't really walk. They're pretty useless for some amount of time. And this fundamentally affects what an organism can and cannot do. And as we've heard it nicely in the previous talk, this changes the rules of the game. This is sort of, this changes how animals interface with the world, and thereby what they actually learn, how they make sense of the world. Roughly, also, we can actually find these features in social development between altricial and precocial animals, where these aspects are being used. So altricial animals are born helpless, they need food from their caregivers, they're born with their eyes shut at birth, they have limited access to the sensory system, lots of other features. Precocial animals, like for example a horse, when they come into this world, they can already walk, they can already explore the environment on their own. And as said, the expression of these altricial and precocial features is modified by controlling the order in which certain sensory events and senses have access to the environment. Yeah, cool. So what are humans? Hands up, precocial. Hands up, altricial. Okay, you're both wrong. They're both. Humans are useless, but clever, or clever but helpless. So humans are a weird mix between altricial and precocial features. They have a large brain, but it's still getting bigger. They have access to quite a few sensory modalities. We're born with slightly limited vision, but the visual system has access to information. Same with the auditory system. In fact, already before we're being born, we're picking up features of the maternal language and learn a lot about what might be relevant later in life. And this is made some authors argue that they're born with a precocial brain, although somewhat disguised by an unwieldy body. or what Portman called secondary artificiality, or what I eventually called postnatal dependency. Slightly different ways of phrasing it. And this comes particularly evident in locomotion compared to apes. So apes actually have a similar strategy. Apes start to walk between 3 to 5 months of age. Infants at around, like, say, 9, 10, 11 months. There's some cultural differences, but they're not that big. And this changes how we engage with the environment. And we're the species with the longest in absolute terms period of dependency on others after being born. This is primarily, so I thought, due because their legs are too heavy to lift, and there's some research that seems to suggest that. It's a bit controversial now. Infants have a stepping reflex that's apparently controlled by aspect of the spine and lower cortical areas, but not by the motor cortex, as has been suggested by Bloomberg and Adolf. So how much actually intentional movement they are able to do during their first months of life is up to debate, and what kind of requirements you have for that, that's an interesting point for discussion. But my point is that if you are dependent on others for such an incredibly long point of time, that leads to a reorganization of perceptual and motor skills. And it produces highly capable learners that are highly constrained in their ability to act on the environment. And this embeds infants in a world in which others are prevalent, and engaging with them becomes the most rewarding thing to do. It becomes a way of making sense of the world. So we can see this, for example, in data by Linda Smith, from Linda Smith's lab, that shows that during their first months of life, faces are incredibly prevalent. Kids just see faces and ceilings, at least in the US. Meanwhile, hands are less prevalent, but increase in prevalence. That changes sort of when children's perspective shifts, because they can start walking. They no longer see the faces so much. They see more arms and hands, and they become mobile. And faces are just effortful to look up to a tall caregiver. That means they spend a lot of time not being able to do much, and their actions are sort of dependent on others, which puts them in high synchronicity contexts. And humans are kind of special in the way that they're also doing this over distance. Most animals only do it when they're like directly proximal to their infants. Some authors have argued that this actually leads so much that infants integrate or don't separate between themselves and their caregivers and their minimal self. Interesting argument. I think that fits quite nicely in here. So then infants, because they can't do anything, they need to figure out a way to interact with the world. You can't walk? Well, maybe you could get someone else to. Get me that water bottle over there. I can ask you. Maybe you can get it for me. And infants not having anything else to do, not being able to, not being distracted by affordances in their environment that are accessible to them, learn that social signals are meaningful indicators of when others are available for interacting with the world. So these communicative signals become meaningful throughout interactions with caregivers, and we don't need to suggest that they're innate, as some authors have done. And essentially, they learn, because infants' exploration is limited, they learn to explore the world through others and explore opportunities for interaction with others, and that provides the way of things like joint attention. And once you have joint attention, you can go on lots of different developmental accounts on the emergence of social behaviors, say Tomasello's account, Richard Moore's account. You could even go down like a Sperbian route. They probably wouldn't be very happy with that. But yeah, so restricting opportunities for action kind of limits what you learn and how you can make sense and how you can explore the world. And you can see that once infants are actually capable of doing things on their own, put them in a room full of toys. They're just running around from room to room, like from toy to toy, and spend much less time with their caregiver. However, in an empty room where there's fewer distractions, they just spend the same amount of steps cycling around the caregiver. And so, but once you've learned that other people are actually informative and interacting with others is helpful and useful and provides you new information, you will turn to others in contexts where you can't do things on your own. So what I'm almost suggesting is it's like a radically embodied inhibitory control. So this postnatal dependency makes infants, well, removes all the distractions from the environment and leaves the caregiver as the primary interface. And that also means that they will learn about the outcomes, the positive outcomes of interactions that are typically way beyond what they typically experience. My favorite example is Frankie, the dog of my parents-in-law. She's a lovely dog. She likes playing fetch, catching a ball. And the problem is whenever she's got the ball, she's not dropping the ball. So your interaction is very short-lived. But you can see she wants to continue playing. She doesn't know how. But as soon as you try to get the ball from her, she gets into a different game. And she has not experienced what happens when she's returning the ball. But because she's so quick and mobile, you're not going to get her to. So there's ways around it. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is that social interaction is costly. Social interaction needs a lot of effort to learn how beneficial. You need put in a lot of effort to learn how beneficial this is. And we might only learn that because we've learned to be, or we've come into this world so dependent on others that we really, really had no other option. So yeah, you get nice things like alter and egocentric perspective taking. They should emerge depending on your task. I'm not going to go into details. You can you can develop an account of mirror neurons that isn't innate, because innate mirror neurons, we know that mirror neurons can be rewired. Any innate mirror neuron system would probably quickly be rewired by experience, so isn't really feasible. Very brief arguments. Potentially you have the foundation for an interactional theory of mind. And one of the predictions I like a lot is that you actually integrate others into your sensory motor and perceptual system. We see this when we act on the world. Things that are within our reach are closer. If I can extend that with a tool, so why does someone else, the presence of another person, not also, who's willing to help me, not also make these things appear closer? There's actually some research in children that suggests this. And in fact, important models of dialogic communication, like the interactive alignment model by Garrett and Pickering, make exactly these suggestions, also in joint action contexts. So cool, we get a lot. I like that. And yeah, I mentioned it provides a reason to communicate. And once you have a reason to communicate, once you have a point, once there's a reason for you to listen to what others are saying and make sense of them, of the utterances that they utter, you get communication. And then you get lots of different learning. So just to summarize up, human social learning emerges out of a uniquely human ontogenetic trajectory in which ready-to-learn infants are limited in their own exploration and turn to learning from others as a means of exploring the environment. And they use sensory motor exploration, just like any other animal, to explore the world through others, not maybe so much as other animals, and to integrate others in motor and perceptual levels. And this account is potentially based on general principles of organismic organization, which gets shaped by interaction of cognition, body, and environment, compatible with radically embodied accounts of intersubjective experiences. And finally, we can potentially have an alternative that actually fits really nicely into this enactive view and explains both similarities and differences of humans and other animals in interaction. And with that, I'd like to thank you. And if you're interested, there's a paper.